Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Well, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to David Shapard. He lives over in Del Mar. He is the author of 5 annotated editions of the novels of Jane Austen, and we'll be showing you the covers and some of the insides as we're talking. He's the author of the annotated Pride and Prejudice, the annotated Persuasion, the annotated Emma, the annotated Sense and Sensibility, the annotated Northanger Abbey, which comes out this fall, and I'm assuming Mansfield Park is in the works. David just told me, so welcome, David. Thanks for coming over.
You.
Well, before we talk about the annotated editions, what they are, how you go about doing them, and all that's involved, why don't we just talk a little bit about the enduring popularity of Jane Austen? What do you think is behind this? I mean, I just got to say, I'm going to read a couple of titles here, and I'm just going to tell people, I'm only scratching the surface. These are some of the recent books the last couple of years that have come out, nonfiction books. You probably know many of these. A Jane Austen Education, Jane Austen's Guide to Thrift, A Truth University Acknowledged, Tea with Jane Austen, What Matters in Jane Austen, Jane Austen, Game Theorist, Jane Austen's Guide to Happily Ever After, All Roads Lead to Austen, Jane Austen's Guide to Good Manners, Confessions of a Jane Austen Addict. Now, I could probably go on forever. This isn't even touching on the fiction, the pastiches, the mysteries, the continuation of the novels, not even to mention the movies. So, David, what do you think is behind this enduring popularity of Jane Austen?
Right, well, I don't know. Well, first, I guess there are two questions. There's the issue of the enduring popularity over the course of the last couple centuries, and then there's a question of this huge upsurge of popularity in the last 15 or 20 years. And the latter, I can't really know why it's become so big, especially recently, even more than any other author.
I mean, I would put it right behind Shakespeare as far as devotion and works about her and, you know, movie versions.
I agree.
I mean, I'd have to just,
Maybe,
I mean, Charles Dickens is popular, et cetera, but there's nothing like this Jane Austen devotion. And
yes, and I don't exactly know what has caused it to be so big in the last 20 years, but I think overall, it is because I think mostly she is really that good. I mean, it's one thing somebody has pointed out that she's probably the only major English language novelist who has never really fluctuated in critical opinion. Other novelists like Dickens and others go through periods where they're highly valued, then there's a reaction as critical opinion changes. Jane Austen, though, has always remained at a high level. No matter what the particular way of looking at literature and novels is, she has always been highly rated. And I would consider her to be definitely, from a purely kind of technical or artistic point of view, to be easily the best novelist in English. Even though some people might prefer other novelists because they like a different subject matter or a different type of story. But I think if you look at the combination of very carefully structured plots where everything fits together, characters who are both very distinctive from each other but also very real and believable, a basic theme that runs through each novel that is worked out very carefully, and extremely brilliant style in the way it's presented, I think you might say all these basic elements are there and they're all first rate in hers, whereas I think other novelists may be strong in some areas but weak in others. So I would just say that, to me, is my basic answer is I think she is really that good if you want to look at why she has continued to be so popular over the course of the century.
And yet, if you know her novels, people watching, I'm sure everyone knows her novels, she doesn't write these long, epic, you know, many layers of society. She really writes about one little town in here or there, or the action doesn't really move too far, you know, around to, you know, all over the world or anything.
That's right. And in fact, I think that was at times had led to her being dismissed when she first came out. For the first 50 years or so after she had published, she was not that popular. Some people read her, but she was not that popular. And I think partly because people wanted something bigger, more epic, or more obviously important, so to speak. But I think one of the things about her that I think eventually caused people to come to appreciate her is that, I think there's a saying, you can see all the colors of the rainbow in a raindrop or something like that. In her case, by focusing on specific things, she can deal with universal themes. And I think she doesn't deal with different levels of society because she only wants to talk about what she knows, and that's a fundamental principle. At one point, a niece of hers was deciding she wanted to be a novelist, and she wrote to her Aunt Jane asking for advice, and Jane Austen responded back. At one point, the niece had the idea, I'll set a novel in Ireland, which would become popular for settings for novels, and Jane Austen said, no, don't do it there because you've never been there, you don't know what things are like there. So she wanted to make sure it was exactly accurate, and I think that very fidelity and accuracy comes through to the reader. You sense that this is just how these people are, and the people are so true to life that even though it's in a very different society, people I know who read her are constantly saying, oh, that's just like somebody I know, because she's dealing with certain basic universal features of human nature.
And yet these books were written, what, the 18 teens, 1820?
Approximately, about, I think they
1811.
appeared from about 18, I think the first appeared in 1811 through about 1816 or 17 was when they came out, though some had been, early versions of them had been written
But it
earlier.
is amazing that, 1850, 1950, 2013, people still can say, this character is just someone
That's
I
right.
know.
I know. It's a remarkable phenomenon, and I think partly because she was such a careful observer of people. I think one thing is, unlike a lot of other writers, she didn't spend her time hobnobbing with other writers. She continued throughout her life just to live a very ordinary life, and I think she had a real feel for just how people are.
Do you think, and you were talking about the last 15, 20 years, her popularity really exploding even more than it was. You think all these filmed versions had anything to do with it, or people were going to read the books anyway?
Oh, I think that definitely stimulated it. I think
Each
that
one's
played an
been
important role.
filmed, numerous.
That's right. And I think partly, and of course, one thing you can say, maybe the rise of things like television miniseries has been valuable because they allow people to deal with the novels in greater depth and length.
Than just a 2-hour movie.
That's right.
I think
where you
the Pride and Prejudice, what was it, 8 or 10 parts was the one that...
That's right. I think that did it. And then there were other things. Though there were also just some regular movies that did it as well. Yes, I think that she had not been subject of a lot of popular films, and I think that stimulated people. And then once people saw the films, I know there are many cases where then they were inspired to read the novels.
Okay. Well, let's start with, you have the annotated editions, and we've already shown, I like how you even annotated the covers. We'll see that, but...
Yes, that was the publisher's idea.
Okay,
Give them credit for
it's
that.
a nice little touch, but as I mentioned, beautiful editions. These are the library's books. People can come in and check them out, but what is, I think I know what an annotated edition is, but why don't you explain, what is an annotated edition? I mean, I've seen annotated Sherlock Holmes, annotated Huckleberry Finn, usually the biggies. But what is an annotated edition of a novel?
Right. Well, I would add that some of these other ones were actually part of the inspiration for doing this, but it's one where alongside the novel, the text of the book, of the novel, or whatever other book is being annotated, you have a series of commentaries or notes explaining things, but in this case, they're right next to the text, so they're very easy to read. There are some versions where you'll have a lot of notes in the back, but that's not nearly as convenient. Here, you have...
they're on opposite pages.
Right.
Well,
some of the annotated ones have been big coffee table-sized books where on the same page you'll have both the novel text and the annotations. I wanted something that was more small, more regular sized, more, I think, easier to handle, and so what I did was the left side is always the novel, and then there are various numbers and then on the right side are the annotations to that page of the novel.
Well, I got to say, some of the pages, or I'm sorry, some of the notes are only a line or a sentence. You're just defining a word. Some of them take up half a page. So it looks like you didn't just go through this line by line. It looks like you went through this word by word practically.
Oh yes, I did. It involved.
Some pages have 7 or 8 notes. It's
somewhat.
Some pages have 7 or
yes.
8. Yeah.
Some pages even more. In fact, sometimes what I would do is there obviously Jane Austen didn't write these with somebody like me in mind, so there are some pages where there isn't so much to say, other pages where there's just a huge amount, and so I would then sometimes divide it with a picture or something to spread it even over 2 pages. Yes, because there are many passages where you can talk about all sorts of things, partly because there often are descriptions of things, and so that's something I think people find especially useful is the historical background. They'll mention all sorts of things like, carriages or features of homes and all. And of course, people nowadays don't know what they're talking about, and this helps people understand
Well, when
that.
someone says, for example, I guess I'll give an example, so-and-so gets $5,000 a year, and everyone always used to, how much money is that?
Right.
So you explain the money. Well, I would say a lot of the annotations, like you've just said, some of them define a word, some of them comment on the action or a character, some of them talk about what people are wearing, maybe how a dance was, the social rules. So how do you decide? Because each one of these has like over 2,000 annotations, each novel. How do you decide what to annotate? And are these the first time Jane Austen's been annotated this
extensively, yes. There have long been, these small paperback versions, which will have a few notes here and there.
But these are, I got to say, these have over 2,000 notes each. I think Pride and Prejudice had 2,300, wasn't it?
Something like that, yes.
So how do you decide what to, and obviously when people are reading the book, they can decide whether to read the note or not, but how do you decide what to put in? I mean, it looks like almost
it's hard. I mean, partly it's a judgment call, and there isn't might say it's an art rather than a science. There is not some sort of formula, but essentially I think about, is this something that people would not easily figure out on their own? And I'm thinking primarily of the people who are either first-time readers or are not that familiar. I think it's inevitable that people who are already really knowledgeable, while they'll find some things that they don't know before, or they'll also find some things they already know. But I'm thinking of more ordinary readers, and I try to think, okay, what would people not be able to see for themselves? And then I try to put an annotation in. And that's why, for example, the historical annotations are probably the one where I put the most effort into, because if they mention something like a carriage or a dance or whatever, I figure people, most people nowadays will not know that. In the case of like defining a word, I say, is this a word that either doesn't exist now or has a different meaning than it's being used there? And in the case of commenting on the novel, again, that's perhaps the hardest of all, because some of these things people could figure out for themselves, but I also like to say, well, if you're not familiar with it, or if you haven't read it that carefully, here are some points that you might not have figured out.
All right, well, here, I'll give some examples of some of the notes. These are some of the topics, and I like how in all your editions here, the bibliographies in the back are also arranged by topic. I'm going to read some topics, and so this is a humongous amount of research. But this will give you a flavor of what is annotated in here. You have things on language, marriage and family. There's all kinds of comments about marriage and family relations and traditions and everything. Position of women, children and childbearing, housekeeping and servants. Servants are always big in the Jane Austen novels. Money, finance, the rural world, urban life, gardens, the Army and the Navy, the church and the clergy. There's always clergymen in the Jane. So not only like your bibliography is arranged, but so you had to consult all these books. So I don't know, theater, transportation, education, books and newspapers, libraries, the postal service. It's like, so I mean, this is how long does it take you to do one of these? You're telling me a year, but it's hard to believe.
Well, it's partly, I guess I'm drawing upon earlier years reading. I mean, first I had, in some of my own studies, I had already read a lot about this period, and then when I did the first Pride and Prejudice, that took me more 2 or 3 years, and then I was able later, when I did the later editions, to draw upon the knowledge I had gained from that. And of course, each time I do a book, it helps prepare for the next one, because many of the basic information that I draw upon, is general. I mean, sometimes each book has certain topics that aren't covered in others. They have to research specially for it. But to a great degree, I'm still able to draw upon a general knowledge of the period and the customs of the time.
So all those a bibliography I just read, many of the, you had to consult a lot of these books. Like if
That's
you're
right.
commenting on the clergy, you had to look up, do research on
That's right.
what a
And I read
clergyman.
all these various, either all or part of all these various books, just to get a sense of it. And I think it's often useful to have read more than one source on a particular subject, because sometimes, different perspectives, or sometimes somebody will make a mistake and then others will correct that or whatever.
Okay, so what sort of got you going? Got you going on wanting to do this? I was mentioning before we started, when you go to all these Jane Austen gatherings or conferences, you may sometimes be the only male, like on the panel or something. It's, a man. Usually we think of Jane Austen as a sort of a women's writer or something, but obviously I've read them all. They're great. I mean,
Yeah, well, I suppose, it is true that most of those who are fans of Jane Austen are women, but I think that they could have very strong appeal. I guess, suppose in my own case, when I was growing up, I did not read her a lot, and I guess I did probably I read a lot of probably nonfiction more than fiction, and when I did read fiction, it often would be the kind of fiction that might deal with, say, political events or something like that, or wars, that might be the sort of thing that men would be more likely to read. But it was partly reading people who are historians and philosophers talking about how much there was in Jane Austen that got me reading her. And once I did, I saw, I really loved it. And again, for me, it's not, I think that for many people, the very fact that it's a romance is critical to the appeal. In my case, I wouldn't say it's critical. I'm happy to read stories that are romances, but I'm also happy to read things that are not. But in her case, it's because she just does such a good job of dealing with the characters and the stories and the ideas in it. And that is what made, as soon as I started reading her extensively, made her my favorite novelist, just because of how good I thought she was.
Yeah, she's can be enjoyable, and there's a sense of universality, I think, in her human character.
Right. I also think another thing is that she bears rereading more than almost any other novelist, because she's very subtle. She doesn't hit you over the head with her point. She kind of just lays it out there and lets you figure it out for yourself. And so each time I read her, I end up discovering things that I hadn't noticed before. And so I think that's also something that can make an annotated version very valuable, because there is so much that you miss, because she's such a careful writer, and each little detail is carefully thought out. And you often, when you're reading it, you want to find out what happens next in the story, so you sometimes miss a lot of these little details. And I think it can be so useful to point them out.
Many of your annotations are comments on the action or the characters, and the plot and everything. Why don't you talk about those kind of annotations as opposed to, talking about what a clergyman wore or something? Why do you have some of those in there?
Well, I think, those I might say they could be seen as less necessary, but I think because she's such a subtle writer, there are a lot of things you could miss. I can say for myself, even though before I embarked on this project, I'd read her numerous times, I'd read books about her, but even still, before doing each book, I would read a whole series of literary commentaries on her and criticism by various people. I consistently found they were frequently pointing out things that I myself hadn't noticed. Some of the things they pointed out were things I had noticed already, but there were always things I hadn't, because she's such a complex and rich author that there are just a lot of things that you wouldn't always notice, and therefore I felt that a lot of ordinary readers could also benefit from the same insight that I was able to benefit from, of saying, here's something you might not have noticed, or you might have seen somebody did something, but you might not appreciate the significance in light of other aspects of the novel.
Here I have an example here.
Okay.
What you're talking about. Again, this is one of, if you guess you add the 4 books up, the thousands, but this is an instance of what you're talking about. These are the kinds of things you're doing. Now, this is from Emma, and this is the character that everyone probably remembers well, Miss Bates. So this is Miss Bates talking. And she's, maybe you can put it in context when I'm done, but she's saying, in short, I do not think I am particularly quick at those sort of discoveries. I do not pretend to it. What is before me, I see. And then you have a note. And then your note says, this statement summarizes Miss Bates well, for while lacking in imagination and intellectual depth, she does observe many things and reports them honestly, albeit disjointedly. This makes her speeches a valuable source of information to the reader. So you're saying, pay attention to what Miss Bates says, even though she's sometimes comes off as I don't know.
Well, actually, partly, I guess that one is a good example, because that was something where I myself, when I first had read Emma, and even the first few times reading it, had to a certain degree skimmed over the speeches involving Mrs. Bates, because, I mean, she's a character who's a bore, and so therefore you have to make her a little tedious often in order to make her believable. And so you have these long speeches that are very disjointed and are almost like stream of consciousness, just words and phrases tossed together without any obvious rhyme or reason. And so it's easy to think, oh, there's nothing here, and to skim over them. But in fact, if you look carefully at them, she uses those speeches not only both to convey something of Miss Bates' personality, and to convey important information to the reader. And in fact, so you get that if you actually read it carefully. So partly that's a good advice to the reader. Yes, if you actually look at these speeches and pay careful attention, you'll find out a lot of valuable information about what's happening. Also, I think it's important just to see her character, that if you look at these incoherent speeches, you might say, oh, she's a complete idiot or something. Well, if you look at them, she is someone who is perceiving what she sees and, is reporting things accurately, even though she isn't putting it together coherently in her mind. So it's sort of something that people who are just reading it might either not read her at all or skim over it, or might read her but not really perceive that she is making
this goes back
valuable and accurate points.
This goes back to what you were saying, the great subtlety of Jane Austen. Now, did you find working on them pretty similar, each one, or were some more challenging than others? I mean, Emma, as opposed to Persuasion, say. I mean, I'm thinking of the heroines in each. Emma, of course, as you mentioned in the introduction there, and if people that know the book, she's sort of one of the more complex Austen heroines, and she goes through the biggest change, I guess you could say. And Anne Elliot in Persuasion is already a mature woman. And I mean, when you're doing the annotations, I mean, do you find differences in doing the books, or are they all pretty much the same?
I mean, there are some differences. I mean, but to be honest, the basic process isn't dramatically different. I mean, of course, let's say comparing Emma to Persuasion, Emma's twice as long, and that is obviously more work. Not only just, you have to annotate a lot more pages, but also the way you have different parts refer to each other. The link presents a different sort of challenge. But in terms of the heroines, I do comment on the heroines differently, but, that's just...
Okay, so you're taking each one as a separate work.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, occasionally there are particular challenges. I mean, in the case of Persuasion, for example, so much of it takes place in the heroine's own head. She doesn't do much. She kind of just observes, and so there are a lot of things you're kind of talking about possible discrepancies between what she observes and what's actually happening or not. In the case of Emma, one element there was that much of the novel, especially in the second half, involves a mystery, and it's a very interesting process where you see, if you know what the solution of the mystery is and you go back and read it, you can see that she gives all this information, that all these events that seem just ordinary, innocuous events have all this added significance. And so I wanted to point that out, but at the same time I wanted to do it, I didn't want to spoil the surprise for first-time readers, so I ended up putting these warnings in there.
Well, I was going to say, some of your annotations have in boldface, all capital letters, spoiler alert, don't read this if you're still reading the...
That's right, because I mean, I know that people, I think my first version of Pride and Prejudice actually that came out, some people complained that I had given some plot spoilers, because in trying to discuss a particular incident, to help explain it further, I would say, well, there's something else that happens later on, and then I found people didn't like that. So then since then, in the later books as well as the more recent version of Pride and Prejudice, try to word it in such a way that I don't give away the story to people who don't know about it. And in the case of Emma, went further because you have this mystery. Much of the artistry of the work consists of involves creating this mystery that you could figure out. So I want to point out all these things that are happening, what in fact is really going on, but at the same time I don't want to spoil the surprise for first-time readers.
Now, do you have a favorite heroine of the Jane Austen novels?
Favorite heroine? I don't know. Maybe I find the heroines. I would say maybe Anne Elliot is maybe the most sympathetic because she is maybe a little more mature and she's very thoughtful. So I guess she might be the heroine.
Okay, I know that's. I shouldn't. Whenever I say, well, this one people love, all six are sort of beloved. So now that you have these four, Northanger Abbey's coming out this fall. What's been the reaction in the Jane Austen world? I know there's that website, the Republic of Pemberley.
That's right.
Are you involved with them in any way? Or?
I was when I first. They were one of the inspirations for my doing this initially. I had participated in the website and enjoyed looking at it, and then when I was trying to think of something to write, because I wanted to be a writer, I decided, well, there was a real market for this based upon that website, as well as other things like the Jane Austen Society and the numerous other books about Jane Austen that were out there. I decided there was a real market here for people who want in-depth analysis. So that was an initial inspiration. Since then, I occasionally look at the website, but I don't. It's well,
how have the books been received? Have you?
As far as I generally what I've seen from that and other Jane Austen blogs and journals. Generally, people like them.
Okay, good.
I mean, of course, there's inevitably some like better than others, but generally the reception has been positive, and I'm a member of a local Jane Austen society for this area, and the people there like these books a lot. And I've got other people I know. I've got a couple relatives who have been might say converted to Jane Austen because of knowing that they like my books.
Now, I think you were telling me, are you involved with the Jane Austen Facebook page? Or is that
I'm not. Well, actually, no. I'm not on Facebook right now, though.
I thought you said you maintained the.
No. The woman who's in charge of publicity for my books for the publisher says that she helps manage the Jane Austen Facebook page, and I believe she said she was going to. So I've contacted her to have to alert her and through that the readers to events where I might be speaking or something.
Now,
because
you do these, have you been to many Jane Austen conferences, literary events around?
I've been to some, though I haven't been to yet any of the big conferences. It's kind of expensive, and I've also during the last several years, I've been so completely focused on writing these books and producing them as quickly as I can that I haven't done as much of these other things. But I have spoken to a number of people. I was just recently, about 2 weeks ago, went down to New York City and spoke at a meeting of the chapter of the New York City branch, which naturally, of course, is a very large branch, and there was about a little more than 100 people there at this talk, and that went very well.
Well, like I say, the book's beautifully done. I mean, I got to say, again, as we're talking, we have people will see some of the things. So before we finish, I'm going to mention people watching. David's going to be here this September. This show will be on all during the summer and stuff. This September, Sunday, September 22nd. Why don't you tell us about the event? You're going to be here with the local Jane Austen group doing something here in our library. What's that about?
That's right. Well, we actually tend to, the local Jane Austen Society meets once a month, usually toward the last or second to last Sunday of the month. And in this case, the meeting will be my speaking, but it will be something that is designed to be accessible to the general public. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show slides, pictures from the period. One of the things that I've done as part of this is I've accumulated literally more than 1,000 pictures from that time, from...
Well, each of these has over 100 illustrations.
Actually, I think the most recent one, both Emma and the more recent edition of Pride and Prejudice, have about 200 in it.
Okay, and these are some of the kinds of pictures.
That's right, and so I have all these pictures of houses of the time, of furniture, of clothing, of carriages, also pictures by cartoonists and satirists that are commenting on society, and I just think it would be a good opportunity to discuss these. I thought people like to look at pictures, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show samples of these pictures, and then
Comment on them,
on them
sure.
and provide my own background information, because I think that's something that can appeal both to people who are real devoted readers, but also just people who have a general interest in the period, because the pictures themselves tell so much about what's going on.
Well, Jane Austen's books first came out about 200 years ago. I think it's safe to say they're still going to be read 200 years from now.
I think so. Yes, I'm confident in that.
Okay. Well, thanks, David, for coming over. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you in September back at the library, September 22nd. It's a Sunday. Dave's going to be talking about all Jane Austen. So thanks for being here. And we'll see you next time on Meet the Author.